Before there was an age to name, there was a world that did not change. Stone stretched in long, silent ridges. Immense arch trees climbed into a sky that did not brighten or dim. Everlasting dragons rested upon those roots and branches, their scales like rough stone, their eyes as patient as the horizons. Time passed without seasons. There was no youth or age, no dawn or dusk, only a steady gray that knew neither becoming nor ending. This is remembered as the Age of Ancients, a time before stories when even memory had nothing to compare itself against. In that stillness, a difference appeared. It did not arrive with thunder. It did not split the sky. A single point of heat and brightness woke beneath the earth, somewhere in the depths where stone remembered pressure and buried fire. The first flame had no history before that moment. It was simply there, and with it came something that the world had never known. From that brightness, the fabric of reality began to separate. Light pulled away from shade. Warmth drew itself apart from the cold. Life budded away from the quiet that would later be called death. The word disparity describes this new condition. Disparity is not a thing you can hold. It is the distance between two states, the slope between what is high and what is low, the fault line between what lives and what lies still. With the first flame, disparity entered the world. Where everything had once been level and unmarked, now there were contrasts that could be seen, felt, and eventually feared. Once disparity existed, it could not be undone. It could only move, clot, and be carried by those strong enough to bear it. Drawn to this fire, certain beings came forth from the dark and found within it immense souls, greater and more potent than the drifting fragments of spirit that clung to lesser life. These came to be known as the Lord's souls, vast concentrations of power born from the first flame itself. One was taken by a towering figure who would be remembered as Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight. Another passed to Lord Nito, a shrouded presence whose domain would become death and decay. A third was claimed by the Witch of Izalith, matriarch and sorcerer whose command of flame would change the world. Apart from them, in the shadows at the edge of the fire, a slighter figure found a different, darker soul. This being, the furtive pygmy, found the dark soul, subtle and divisive, and chose to hide it away. To hold a Lord's soul was to carry a piece of disparity itself. Gwyn's soul shone with light and the power of lightning. Nito's soul gathered every slow and certain ending that flesh can know. The witch's soul burned with generative heat, a flame that could shape and devour. The dark soul was quieter, fragmented and shared, capable of dividing into many smaller pieces. In time, those fragments would be called humanity. Those who bore them would be called humans. In this way, the birth of the first flame was also the hidden birth of mankind, though that truth lay in shadow and was easily forgotten. Gwyn did not look upon the still world and accept it as it was. He saw the dragons upon their crags, immense and unchanging, and he saw in the flame the possibility of a different order. Nito regarded the same world through a veil of bones and saw that even the mightiest scale should one day crack. The Witch of Izalith felt in her soul a fierce generosity, an urge to kindle, to multiply, to turn ember into inferno. Each of them was shaped by the soul they carried, and the souls they carried were shaped in turn by their choices. Between them a loose council formed, not written in any law, but carried in shared intention. They would take the power of the flame and use it to remake the age. The dragons stood in the way of that new order. Their bodies were armored with stone-like scales that did not yield. Their immortality rested in a mysterious core known as the primordial crystal, the hidden certainty of their permanence. In the stories told later, the war between lords and dragons is remembered in flashes, not in detailed campaigns. Gwyn and his knights hurled bolts of lightning that split dragonstone and tore wings from the air. The witch and her daughters flooded battlegrounds with storms of sorcery and flame. Nito spread mists of disease and inevitable rot, weakening even those who had believed themselves eternal. At some point, a dragon without scales, Seath the Scaleless, betrayed his own kind and tore the secret of the primordial crystal from them, breaking the guarantee of their endless life. The war ended not with a single blow, but with a long chain of defeats that pushed the dragons out of history and into myth. With the everlasting dragons overthrown, a new age began. Where archtrees had watched alone, cities rose. At the heart of this changing world, Gwyn built Anor Londo, a city of sunlight and white stone that crowned a peak above the clouds. There he gathered his pantheon and retinue, knights clad in linked metal, silver archers upon high parapets, sentinels carved like giants. The Witch of Izalith returned to her own domain, a city of flame and study where pyromancy matured from instinct into craft. Nito withdrew into deep caverns, attending to layers of death and burial that spread in quiet beneath the living world. The pygmy holding the dark soul had already divided that power and hidden among the shadows. From that act, people arose, fragile in the face of gods and giants, yet carrying a strange and enduring potential. This new span of history is remembered as the Age of Fire. It was an age defined not only by literal flame, but by the things that flame represents: growth, splendor, visible power, and a sense of ordered hierarchy. Gwyn and his clan were worshipped as gods. Their rule rested on the idea that light should remain above, that the sun should continue to rise over Anor Londo, that the line between those who ruled and those who served was as natural as the line between day and night. Shrines and temples echoed with hymns to sunlight. Bonfires burned in halls and crossroads, little mirrors of the first flame tended by those inducted into their care. Yet even in the height of that brilliance, the nature of flame did not change. To burn is always to consume. The first flame was not an exception. It had a beginning, and so it carried within it the possibility of an ending. In time, subtle signs emerged that its strength was fading. The light in Anor Londo thinned. The power that flowed so easily through miracles and lightning began to dim. Where the fire waned, shadows grew more confident, and in those shadows the dormant dark stirred. Humanity, born from fragments of the dark soul, continued to spread, and with it came questions that had no place in the old stone eras. The fading of the first flame had consequences that were not only symbolic. As the primal fire weakened, a mark began to appear upon certain humans. This was the dark sign, a ring of scorched flesh that bound them to a new condition. Those cursed by it would die and return, bodies reforming at sites of flame known as bonfires. At first, this might have seemed like a blessing. Death lost its finality. However, each return shaved away pieces of self. Memory thinned, purpose frayed. Eventually, if the process continued, the cursed would lose all sense of identity and become hollow, driven only by faint habit and distant hunger. The undead curse, as it came to be called, was both symptom and mechanism. It revealed that the old order was under strain, and it ensured that the souls of the dead remained in circulation. To understand the Lords of Cinder, it is important to see how Gwyn responded to this crisis. The Lord of Sunlight did not accept the fading of the flame as a natural conclusion. For him, the Age of Fire was not merely one chapter among many. It was the expression of everything his soul represented: light, rank, the bright certainty of command. If the first flame failed, then the Age of Fire would end. In its place would come what some named the Age of Dark, an age in which humanity and its fragmented dark soul might have risen fully. Gwyn looked into that possibility and chose to reject it. The choice he made would define the pattern of ages. The act that he conceived was both simple and terrible in its implications. The first flame was fed by souls. It burned with the vastness of disparity itself. If it began to fade, then it could be rekindled, prolonged, by offering to it a soul of similar magnitude. Gwyn resolved to offer his own. He would leave Anor Londo, descend to the kiln of the first flame, and walk into the fire he had used to founder his dominion. Such a step was not taken lightly. It meant abandoning his city, his children, and the shape of the world he had created. It also meant that his identity would be consumed, reduced to cinders and lingering embers, subsumed into the very force he wished to preserve. Those who went with him understood that this was not triumph, but sacrifice. The great knights of Gwyn, silver and black, dragon-slaying and wolf-chasing, had built their legends upon battlefields. Now they watched their lord choose a different field, one of ritual and annihilation. He did not simply die, he became fuel. The first flame flared brighter as he entered it. From that point on, he would be remembered with a new title. No longer only Lord of Sunlight, he was Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, a being whose soul had been burned down in the name of extending the Age of Fire. This is the core idea behind a Lord of Cinder. It is not merely a ruler nor any powerful being. A Lord of Cinder is a figure whose soul has been used to rekindle the first flame. Their identity does not vanish entirely, but it is seared, scattered, and changed. They become part of the very fire that they offer themselves to, and some echo of them lingers as a charred remnant in the kiln or as a legend that shapes future ages. Gwyn was the first to walk this path. In doing so, he established a precedent and a doctrine. That doctrine can be described simply: when the fire fades, it must be linked. Linking the fire means approaching the first flame and surrendering one's accumulated soul to it, knowing that this will unmake the self as it has been known. To the gods of Anor Londo and their allies, this was presented as duty. The continuation of light, of the structures built around it, justified the cost. For humans and other beings bound to the cycle, the doctrine filtered down in fragments. Prophecies of chosen undead, shrines that spoke of kindling, covenants that raised flame as a sacred sign. Around this doctrine grew an infrastructure of belief and ritual. The bonfires that dotted the world were more than resting places. Each one was a small mirrored link to the greater flame, kindled by bones and ashes, tended by keepers who had bound their eyes and dedicated their existence to tending the embers. Through these fires, undead could return again and again, drawn as if by gravity. Through them, the world quietly taught its cursed inhabitants that the answer to fear, to fading, to hollowing, was always more flame. Yet the first flame could not be deceived by ceremony. Each time it was linked, each time a great soul was poured into its heart, the result was not a true restoration, only a postponement. The Age of Fire would brighten, then dim once more. Another age would crest and sink, cities rising and falling, lineages flowering and withering. Inside these cycles, individual stories played out. Some who lived under the sun never knew that the flame they took for granted had been burning through sacrificed lords. The Witch of Izalith, in her own time, perceived the fading of fire as a problem and sought a different solution. Where Gwyn chose to feed the existing flame, she attempted to create a new one. Her plan drew on her mastery of sorcery and pyromancy, on her own lord soul and the resources of her city. She tried to craft a second first flame, an echo that might serve as replacement. The attempt failed catastrophically. Instead of a stable, holy fire, she birthed the flame of chaos, a wild and mutative force that consumed Izalith, twisted its inhabitants, and gave rise to demons. In that disaster, a different lesson emerged. The power of the first flame was not easily replicated, and attempts to circumvent its nature came with their own terrible costs. In the caverns of Nito, the spread of death and burial continued. Tombs multiplied, crypts deepened. The Gravelord's role did not end when Gwyn linked the fire. People still died, and their souls still moved, drawn toward bonfires or pulled down into deeper waiting. The dark soul, too, continued to divide and circulate. Humanity persisted not because the gods willed it, but because it was foundational to the world that had grown around the flame. Even as gods diminished, people multiplied. In the long stretches between one linking and the next, humans built kingdoms, fought wars, and told stories without fully understanding the foundation upon which they rested. Over time, the idea of a chosen undead emerged. According to this belief, when the fire approached a certain threshold of fading, an undead would be chosen by fate or prophecy to undertake a journey. This journey would carry them across ruined fortresses, fetid swamps, ancient forests, and finally into the heartlands of the old gods. Along the way, they would gather the souls of those who once held great power, including remnants of the original lords. In the end, they would stand before the first flame and either link it anew or turn away, letting it go dark. The doctrine of linking insisted that the noble, rightful choice was to step into the fire. From the perspective of those who held to the age of fire, this pattern seemed necessary. It preserved a familiar structure. It allowed statues to continue standing in their niches, even if the gods they depicted had long since vanished. It gave suffering a purpose, even if that purpose was simply the maintenance of a cycle. Yet there were always other voices, quieter and fewer, who suggested that to prolong the age of fire was to cling to an order that was already ending. These voices saw in the dark not merely fear, but a different future, one in which the many fragments of humanity might come into their own. The notion of restraint appears in unexpected places in this story. Gwyn did not lack power. At the height of his reign, he commanded armies, miracles, and the loyalty of those who had known him through war and peace. His choice to link the fire was, in one sense, an act of restraint toward himself. He denied his continued presence in the world so that the age he had created might endure. Bonfire keepers, too, practiced restraint in smaller ways, binding their eyes, limiting their lives to the tending of flame. Some undead, faced with the hollowing that awaited them, retreated into small, protected spaces rather than pursue the grand invitation to sacrifice. Restraint took many forms: refusal, acceptance, withdrawal. And yet again and again the pattern returned to a simple tension. Fire brightened, fire dimmed. When it dimmed, someone was asked to give everything to restore it. The doctrine did not advertise its cumulative cost. Souls were finite, even if their fragments could be gathered and recombined. The more cycles unfolded, the more the world around them reflected accumulated ash, ruined structures, and lingering despair. Each linking smoothed over the fracture lines for a time, but beneath the surface the strain remained. Across ages, many who linked the fire became Lords of Cinder. Some were gods or near-divine beings. Others were humans who had ascended through suffering and determination. Their names were not all recorded. Some exist only as faint traces glimpsed through equipment, half-ruined inscriptions, or places scorched with a particular pattern of light. The sum of their sacrifices, their souls burned down and added together, would in time coalesce into something greater and stranger. A composite will of all those who had chosen or been driven to serve the flame. This composite is later remembered as the Soul of Cinder, a shifting figure that echoes Gwyn and all those who followed him. It is not a single person, but a kind of living memory of the act of linking. When it moves, its stance changes. It fights like different people have fought, mirroring the myriad paths that led others to the kiln. The very existence of this being is a ledger of history. Every swing of its sword, every invocation of sorcery or miracle is a quiet reminder of how many lives were dedicated to the preservation of a single age. While this accumulation took shape in the far future, the structures that would support it were already forming. Thrones were raised for Lords of Cinder yet to come. Categories emerged. Those who linked the fire were set apart, commemorated, and sometimes called upon even after their death. Their cinders, the burnt remains of everything they had been, became not just relics but tools. Through them, new rituals could be attempted. Through them, the past could be leveraged again, asking old sacrifices to bear the weight of new decisions. At some point in these long cycles, the pattern began to falter. The first flame dwindled more severely. The efforts to link it met with resistance. Some who were chosen to take up the title of Lord of Cinder refused outright. Others were forced to the task and left behind only bitterness and warped aftermaths. Kingdoms rose in the shadow of old ruins bearing traces of earlier ages without fully understanding them. In one such age, a kingdom named Lothric built its power on prophecies of linking and the breeding of a royal heir meant for sacrifice. In another, a legion swore itself to the hunting of the abyss, carrying the wolf blood of a knight who had faced that darkness before. Elsewhere, a devourer of men dreamed of deep seas and was steered toward the fire for his strength alone. In this later age, the title Lord of Cinder took on an almost bureaucratic quality. It was a role expected to be filled, a blank in a ritual that officials and priests assumed would always have a name written into it. The bells of awakening which once roused a single undead to a singular destiny now tolled with a different purpose. To unearth those who had already fulfilled their duty and bring them, unwilling or not, back to their thrones. Instead of finding new volunteers for sacrifice, the world called to the cinders of those who had already burned and demanded one more service. The result of this call was the age that would be remembered in the tales of the Ashen One. 5 Lords of Cinder were bound to answer. Ludleth of Corland, a small and enigmatic figure who claimed to have linked the fire once before. The Abyss Watchers, a legion united in soul and purpose. Aldrich, once a cleric, later a devourer whose body had become a black sludge. Yorm the Giant, a ruler who had offered himself to save his city from a different profane flame. And Prince Lothric, born to be sacrificed, yet turned away from his destiny. Each of these lords carried their own history, their own motives, burdens, and refusals. By the time the Ashen One rose seated upon old ash in a dilapidated shrine, the pattern had frayed. The first flame guttered. The Lords of Cinder had abandoned their thrones and scattered back into their domains, taking their cinders with them. They had made their choices, some long ago and some very recently, and now refused to be bound again by the expectations of a failing order. The bells tolled not as prophecy, but as summons. They called to bones, to thrones, to buried memories. The task that lay ahead in this age was not simply to link the fire once more. It was to gather the scattered cinders, to confront each lord in turn, and to decide what their stories meant when taken together. The Ashen One would walk through lands built on previous sacrifices, through cathedrals where belief had twisted, through cities burned by different flames. Every step would be taken upon the accumulated ash of earlier ages. Every bonfire would be lit from embers that had already devoured heroes and tyrants alike. The world stood again at a hinge. The age of fire still clung to existence, thin and brittle. The dark, patient and quiet, waited as it always had. Humanity continued to hollow and to endure. The doctrine of linking remained in place, but its authority had weakened. The Lords of Cinder had, in their different ways, begun to question or resist the role that doctrine had assigned them. Their doubts, failures, and defiance formed cracks in the ritual that had governed the world since Gwyn first walked into the flame. It is at this threshold that this first part of the tale rests. The cosmic pattern has been traced from gray stillness to blazing age, from the birth of disparity to the habit of sacrifice. The first flame is burned through gods and kings, through witches and nameless undead. The title of Lord of Cinder has shifted from singular honor to cyclical burden to reluctant obligation. In the dim of a crumbling shrine, an unkindled ash opens tired eyes. Outside, somewhere beyond the broken walls and twisted trees, 5 absent lords sit in judgment of their own past choices, whether they intend to or not. The fire waits, neither fully bright nor fully gone, caught in the long moment before another decision is made. The pattern strains, but it has not yet broken. The one who rose in that crumbling shrine was not a normal undead. The stories of earlier ages spoke of cursed humans who would die, awaken at their bonfire, and slowly lose themselves. The figure who stirred on a bed of old ash was something slightly different. This was an unkindled, ash animated by a soul that had failed to link the fire in a previous attempt. An unkindled had already been judged once by the flame and found wanting. They were not the spearhead of a new age, at least not by design. They were a remnant, a leftover, a possibility that had not been claimed. The term unkindled suggests what they are missing. To be kindled is to be set alight, to be fully accepted by the flame and burned into it without remainder. The unkindled had approached that destiny and fallen short. Souls like this drifted back into a world that had almost forgotten them, drawn to the old shrine where thrones waited and bells sometimes tolled. They were not chosen by prophecy in the way older tales described. They were called by vacancy. The Lords of Cinder had no desire to return to their seats. The first flame could not complain in words. The shrine, with its broken walls and weary attendants, simply waited until something answered. Firelink Shrine in this age was not the radiant birthplace of miracles that Anor Lundo once had been. It was a collapsed echo, a gathering point built from ruins belonging to several times at once. Stone arches, broken stairs, and crude wooden supports leaned into one another as if to keep from falling. In the center, at the lowest point, a coiled fragment of a sword sat in a bed of pale embers. That fire was small, but it clung to existence with a stubbornness that matched the ash-covered figure who rose alongside it. Around this hub, thrones waited on a higher ring, their faces carved with names and titles. Each throne spoke of a lord who had linked the fire and then, in this failing age, been roused again. One was wide and heavy, built for a giant who had once taken flame into his own heart. Another spoke through its design of a legion, of many feet and blades moving as one will. Another carried faint traces of a devourer who had tasted gods and dreamt of deep seas. One belonged to a prince who had never taken up his appointed role, built high as if to remind him that his blood had been bred for sacrifice. A smaller throne, almost modest, bore the mark of Ludleth of Corland, who had chosen the fire before the others and now sat upon it once more. Among these, only Ludleth remained at his post. Where giants and princes had turned away, this small burnt figure had taken his seat and stayed. His body bore the cost of his earlier choice. Limbs were damaged. Flesh had shrunk and blackened. Yet he endured and spoke gently of the thing he had done. He did not shy away from it, nor did he glorify it as conquest. His presence was a quiet ledger entry, a living witness that linking the fire was survivable in some partial way, even if what returned was altered almost beyond recognition. Claim by claim, the situation unfolded. The fire was fading again. The Lords of Cinder, whose cinders had been meant to reinforce it, had abandoned their thrones. The bells had answered this dereliction by calling not fresh heroes, but ash. The unkindled who rose here did not know their own name. They knew only that something in their chest resonated with the weary embers and with the carved titles over each empty seat. Where other undead might have wandered, this one was drawn toward a path laid out by others who had made and then refused their vows. The human consequence of all this became clear as the world beyond the shrine revealed itself. High walls ringed a once proud settlement now choked with hollowed residents and patrolled by fanatics who worshiped the flame in fear rather than hope. In the distance, towers collapsed into one another in impossible angles as if the strata of ages had been stacked in haste. Wherever the unkindled stepped, they found people who had built their lives around fragments of the linking doctrine and fragments of the dark. Some clung to a failing sun. Others whispered of endings and release. Many simply tried to persist from one miserable day to the next. Restraint in this context took forms that were easy to miss. The firekeeper at the shrine tended the central bonfire without leaving it, accepting that her role was to nurture possibility and guide souls, not to impose a choice on them. The handmaid, surrounded by relics and bones from forgotten times, traded what she could but did not try to seize or control the cinders. Ludleth, for all his history, did not command the unkindled. He offered counsel and tools, but he did not order them into the fire. Where earlier ages had shouted about destiny, this one spoke in hints and invitations. Yet the structure beneath those quiet gestures remained rigid. The thrones were not ornamental. Each one required cinders. Each lord who had abandoned their post had taken their cinders with them into lands shaped by their nature. The pattern insisted that those cinders must be returned. Without them, the way to the kiln of the first flame would not open. The unkindled, who owed nothing to this order and had already failed it once, now found themselves placed in the position of its final custodian. The first lord whose history presses into view is that of the Abyss Watchers. They were founded in distant times, modeling themselves on a knight who had once walked at the edge of the abyss and refused to break. The abyss is not simply a dark place. It is a corruption that grows where the dark soul is drawn out of balance, where humanity swells and twists without form or measure. It consumes landscapes, people, and even time if left unchecked. The Abyss Watchers took it as their creed that they would seek out such outbreaks wherever they appeared and cut them down. Their order settled in Farron, where swamp and fortress mingled, where ruins jutted up like broken teeth from murky water. There they forged a covenant around shared blood. The souls of the first Watchers were mingled so that every member carried a portion of the same will. They moved like a pack and fought like a single blade, each drawing upon the same feral flame. Their power lay not only in their swords, but in the way they accepted the loss of individual distinction in favor of a unified purpose. In time, the lords who governed the cycle judged that the Abyss Watchers had earned the right and obligation to link the fire. They became Lords of Cinder, sacrificing their bound soul to prolong the age of fire, but the abyss they had fought did not vanish from the world. It resurfaced in new forms, spread by old mistakes and new ambitions. The blood that united them became troubled. When they returned from the fire, they did so altered and unstable. Their shared will turned inward. In the damp halls of Farron Keep, surrounded by the ash of their own fallen, the Watchers began to cut one another down in endless, meaningless battles, unable to distinguish ally from enemy. The human consequence of their story is a legion that once existed to protect the world from a formless dark, now trapped in a cycle of self-destruction. Soldiers who had accepted a life without individual glory found themselves unable to stop fighting even when the fight had lost its purpose. Their restraint had been absolute in the field, yet in the end it could not protect them from the weight of the duty they had assumed. They abandoned their throne not out of laziness, but because their minds and souls had been consumed by the very forces they had sworn to contain. Yet the doctrine of linking did not change to accommodate their fate. A throne stood empty, a name remained carved above it. The unkindled, treading carefully through the swamp and watching the Watchers slay and rise and slay again, became the only one capable of resolving their story. When the last of them fell and their shared soul settled, their cinders could be gathered. Their legacy did not vanish. Their ashes and their memory were moved to the shrine where their throne finally received the weight it had been waiting for. Another lord, far from swamp and wolf blood, had been a giant. Yorm ruled the Baalidius, once thriving profaned capital, a city that rose around a great furnace and looked upon a sea of fire with a mixture of awe and dread. Giants in this age were fewer than they had been once, but Yorm was not an outsider imposed on the city. He was chosen as its protector, entrusted with keeping a terrible flame from consuming his people. That flame, called the Profaned Flame, had burst into being as a curse, a fire that delighted in ruin rather than renewal. Yorm's nature held both power and reluctance. He was immense, capable of crushing enemies with a single sweep of his blade, yet he understood that his strength alone could not solve every threat. He gave up his personal shield, an act of symbolic vulnerability to show his people that he would stand between them and the profaned flame with his own body. He made a pact with a knight from afar, entrusting to that knight a sword shaped to strike giants down, the storm ruler, in case he ever lost his way. In that promise, he accepted that someone might one day need to kill him for the sake of the same city he swore to defend. When Yhorm linked the fire, he did so to save his people from the spreading profaned flame. He chose to become a Lord of Cinder not for conquest but for containment. His sacrifice was meant to smother a different kind of fire. Yet when he was roused by the call for lords to return, he did not go back to his throne. Instead, he returned to his ruined capital, now half sunk and deserted, and sat upon his old seat waiting. His people were gone, burned or scattered. The profaned flame remained, a mark of failure. The giant who had once stepped forward now refused to move. The human consequence of his story is most visible in the emptiness around him. A whole city turned to quiet ash, its plazas filled with statues and charred brick. The only sounds are distant, the occasional clatter of a stray prisoner or the low rushing roar of fire from below. Yhorm's restraint appears in the way he simply sits, enormous and unresisting as if inviting judgment. He does not strike out into the world to demand gratitude for his past deeds. He waits in the dark and accepts that the one who comes to claim his cinders may be someone who once called him friend. Yet again, the cycle does not bend. The throne in the shrine bears his title. The ritual demands that his cinders return. When the unkindled finally stands before him, it is not to plead or argue, but to bring his long story to a close in the only language the age understands. When Yhorm falls for the last time and his body scatters into brightness and ash, his cinders travel not back to the capital he loved, but to a waiting seat in the deteriorating shrine. Another lord began as a simple cleric. Aldrich was once associated with a church that worshipped the light and the gods. At some point, he became consumed by a new appetite. He developed a taste not just for food, but for people, for their flesh and their souls. His body changed to match this hunger, swelling and dissolving until it was no longer a body at all, but a viscous mass of black sludge shot through with bones. He did not walk. He seeped. His followers, horrified yet enthralled, turned his habits into a kind of dark liturgy. For Aldrich, the term dream came to mean something more than the ordinary experience of sleep. He dreamt of deep seas, of a world where everything was fluid and formless, where gods and men alike drifted in a dark ocean. To him, this was not nightmare, but revelation. The church that had once served the gods of Honor Lundo shifted to serve him instead, justifying his excesses as a kind of consumption of sin. Another power, the pontiff who ruled over a frost-lit city, saw in Aldrich a tool that could be used to reshape the world. Through careful manipulation, Aldrich was raised to the rank of Lord of Cinder, his gluttonous soul thrown into the first flame to sustain it. When Aldrich returned from that burning, he did not remain bound to the shrine. He was drawn instead to the place where Gwyndolin, one of Gwyn's children, had once presided over illusions and light. In the ruined cathedral of Honor Lundo, beneath a cold and artificial moon, Aldrich lay coiled around the last surviving god of sunlight's line and devoured him slowly. To devour a god in this world is to take on aspects of that god's power and shape. Arcs of darkened light coursed through his sludge. The dignity of an old divine line was reduced to fuel for a creature whose only real doctrine was hunger and dream. The human consequence of Aldrich's fate is written across the bodies and minds of those who followed him. Priests turned from offering prayers to offering captives. Soldiers learned to revere the sound of bones dissolving in tar. The city that had once guarded a path to the painted world now became a place where tall, thin knights watched as their lord feasted on what remained of their own myths. In choosing him as a Lord of Cinder, the managers of the cycle had accepted that a soul like this was acceptable fuel. They had decided that the continuation of the Age of Fire justified elevating a devourer of gods. Restraint appears in Aldrich's story mainly by its absence. He does not stop himself from pursuing his vision of a deep-sea future. He does not limit his feeding. He abandons his throne without a backward glance and coils instead around the most potent food he can find. Others must exercise restraint against him. The unkindled who enters that cathedral does so knowing that each step is taken upon layers of absorbed lives. To bring Aldrich back to his proper throne is to take his cinders out of the shape he has remade for himself and place them among the others where they no longer have a mouth. Closer to the shrine in blood, if not in distance, sits the story of Prince Lothric. The kingdom that bears his name devoted itself to one project above all others. It sought to produce an heir who would be suited to linking the fire. Scholars, clerics, and knights all bent their knowledge toward this end. In Lothric's royal line, bloodlines were considered less as families and more as recipes. When at last a frail, brilliant prince was born, they considered their task complete. His life from the first was shaped around one expectation. He would one day walk into the flame and preserve the Age of Fire, just as Gwyn had done, just as other lords had done after him. From a young age, Lothric was instructed in miracles, lore, and the history of the flame. He was shown visions of burnt lords, of bright ages, and of the dark that would come if he refused. Yet as he grew, he also had access to books, scrolls, and observations that his educators did not intend for him to weigh equally. He learned that the linking had been done many times. He learned that each sacrifice brightened the world only briefly. He learned that entire kingdoms had risen and fallen between linkings, their accomplishments forgotten to all but a few archivists and hollow scholars. Faced with this pattern, the prince drew his own conclusion. He decided that his own life would not be added to the pile of fuel. He saw the Age of Fire not as a sacred order, but as a long postponement of an inevitable change. Instead of stepping into the flame, he withdrew, closing himself in his chambers high above the city, surrounded by failed experiments and deformed attendants. His elder brother, Lorran, once a proud knight, chose to share his siblings' burden. In some way that the game's legends leave partly veiled, the two became bound in body and soul. Lorran's legs became useless, but he carried his brother on his back into the world when they needed to face it, taking Lothric's burden as his own. The human consequence of their decision was severe. The kingdom that had bent itself around the project of producing a linker of fire now had a prince who refused to link. Faith, drilled into its people for generations, lost its focus. Knights once proud of their role as guardians of a future sacrifice now fought without clear purpose. The sky above the castle twisted. The land beneath it shuddered, pulled toward the conflux where other places and times collapsed. Lothric's restraint was real. He refused to give in to the pressure of those who had made him. Yet his refusal came at the cost of everything his line had ruled. In the end, the unkindled climbed through those collapsing towers and found the two brothers waiting in a chamber open to the broken sky. Lorran swung his sword in wide, burning arcs, his brother clinging to his back like a pale shadow. When they finally fell, their souls did not fly free, but settled into a coiled bond that the unkindled gathered as cinders. The two who had wished to step outside the cycle were folded back into it, their resistance resolved not by conviction but by force. The last of the named lords in this age, Ludleth of Corland, occupies a smaller space in the history books, but an important one in the shrine. He is the one Lord of Cinder who answered the call. Once in a previous cycle he had linked the fire. He did not do so as a giant, a legion, or a prince. He was an exile from a distant land, small and regarded with suspicion by others. His choice to step into the kiln came not from expectation placed on him by a kingdom, nor because he sought to wield the flame as a weapon. He did it because he believed it needed to be done and saw no one else stepping forward. The fire judged him as it judged all. His body burned. His soul fed the first flame. What returned was a damaged shell, but with memory intact. When the call for lords to take their thrones came again, Ludleth answered instantly. He endured the pain of simply existing in his burnt state because he considered it part of a promise he had already made. He did not chase power outside the shrine. He remained in that dim hall, encouraging those who came through to consider the significance of their choices, hinting at alternate paths without forcing them. Ludleth's restraint might appear quiet compared to battles in flooded crypts or cathedrals, yet it is in some ways the clearest. He does not ask for 2 sacrifices from others while giving only one of his own. He sits and burns and accepts that his earlier choice has consequences that will endure as long as he does. When the unkindled places the cinders of the other lords upon their thrones, Ludleth does not demand that the cycle continue. He explains how to proceed, offers a means of shaping the outcome, and then leaves the final step to someone who has already borne great cost. When the Abyss Watcher's cinders, Yorm's cinders, Aldrich's cinders, and the joined cinders of Lothric and Lorien have all been dragged back to their waiting seats, the shrine changes. Flames curl up the sides of the thrones. The central bonfire brightens briefly, sending a narrow column of light upward. The firekeeper steps forward, ready to guide the unkindled to the place where Gwyn once walked. The way to the kiln of the first flame opens not as a physical staircase, but as a transition from the crumbling world into a region made entirely of ash and memory. The kiln in this age is no longer a chamber in a mountain. It is a landscape of white dunes and charred architecture, a place where the remains of all previous linkings have settled. Slabs of stone, hints of towers, and the outlines of walls emerge from the ash as if the bones of earlier cities have surfaced. The sky is pale and sunless. In the distance, at the heart of this place, a figure waits with sword in hand. This is the soul of Cinder, the embodied sum of those who have linked the fire. The term soul of Cinder captures a paradox. A soul suggests one identity, one continuous line of memory. Cinder suggests remains, the powder left after burning, fragile and easily scattered. This being is both. It is a shifting composite, its movements and attacks changing as it draws upon different echoes within itself. At one moment it fights like a nameless knight, in another like a pyromancer, in another like a sorcerer, in another like the Lord of Sunlight himself. The music of all these past paths moves through its gestures. The human consequence of the soul of Cinder's existence lies in what it represents, even beyond the fight itself. Every lord who has ever walked into the flame is present here, not as a clear face, but as a trace of will. The composite stands as gatekeeper to the fire it has fed, demanding another demonstration of determination before allowing the ritual to proceed. It does not speak. It does not explain. Its restraint lies in the fact that it only exists to test and to be overcome. It does not chase those who turn away. It does not judge motives. It stands, attacks, falls, and rises in a pattern as old as the cycles that birthed it. Yet when the soul of Cinder is finally defeated and its body collapses into embers, the pattern hesitates. For the first time, the story acknowledges openly that this is not a single road. The firekeeper can be called, brought to the kiln. The unkindled, whose life has been defined by failure, ash, and second chances, is given a choice that even some gods did not have. They can step into the flame and link it, becoming yet another Lord of Cinder, binding their soul to the cycle and prolonging the age of fire for one more span of history. Or they can step back, call the firekeeper, and allow the flame to fade. If the unkindled chooses to link the fire, the result is familiar but still immense. Their body burns. Their sense of self dissolves into the brightness. The first flame, reinvigorated, flares out across the ash. The sky warms. The age of castles, miracles, and established hierarchies endures. Statues in forgotten chapels glow once more. Knights lift their heads as sunlight returns to their weathered helm crests. The cost is one more soul poured into the great account book of sacrifice. The name of the Ashen One is not written in that ledger, but their essence is. If the unkindled steps away and allows the firekeeper to complete a different ritual, the flame is gently taken in hand and covered. The world does not end in an instant. Instead, light recedes like the last embers of a bonfire being slowly smothered. The sky darkens not with storm, but with the soft onset of night. Shapes that were hard to see when everything was bright begin to emerge. The firekeeper speaks of tiny flames that will one day dance in the dark, hints that humanity and its fragmented soul may have a future not entirely bound to the will of old lords. In another hidden path pursued by those who listen to the sable church of Lundor, the unkindled can take the flame into themselves not as a sacrifice, but as a tool. Through rituals that scar the flesh and soul with dark sigils, they prepare their body as a vessel not for the fire's continuation as it has always been, but for a new order in which the dark and the flame are entwined under human dominion. In that outcome, the first flame is usurped rather than simply linked or extinguished. The term Age of Man rises as a possibility, neither wholly light nor wholly dark. These outcomes are not all simultaneously true within a single continuity. They are presented as possibilities, as ways the story can resolve. Canon does not fix firmly which of them occurred. The games themselves invite players to inhabit different versions of the Ashen One and to make different choices. For our purposes, all that needs to be acknowledged is that the cycle reached a point where absolute obedience to the doctrine of linking was no longer treated as the only path. The human consequences of all three possibilities ripple outward in imagination rather than clear text. If the Age of Fire continues, then more souls will be asked. More lords will burn, more kingdoms will rise and fall beneath a sun that does not admit its own fragility. If the fire is allowed to die, then a long dark begins, one that may permit humanity to find forms of community and meaning not mediated by gods of sunlight. If the fire is usurped, the world moves into an experiment that no ancient text fully anticipated, where the dark soul and the first flame coexist under the will of those who were once called mere undead. Throughout these possibilities, restraint and determination weave together. Gwyn's first choice to link the fire shapes every later moment, but it does not dictate them entirely. The Witch of Izalith's attempt to replace the flame shows that even gods can reach beyond their limits and fail. The Abyss Watcher's decision to share a soul shows that unity can become both strength and vulnerability. Yorm's promise to his city and night shows that even a giant can accept the need to be stopped. Aldrich's hunger shows how doctrine can be corrupted when appetite is given divine weight. Lothric's refusal shows that a life built for sacrifice can still choose not to be sacrificed. Ludlith's quiet endurance shows that one small figure can carry a decision longer than some kingdoms. The zoom from cosmic to intimate and back again is constant. On the cosmic scale, the story is simple. There was a first flame, and ages of fire and dark will follow one another until some deeper principle resolves. On the intimate scale, there are individuals sitting on cold stone steps wondering whether the pain they carry has meaning. There are knights who clean their blades after fighting creatures they do not understand. There are keepers of bonfires who listen to the crackle of embers and imagine they hear voices in them, the voices of those who burned before. At the end of this long arc, the title Lord of Cinder no longer feels like a simple honor. It is an index of cost. Each lord is a story of someone who took their own soul, or had it taken from them and let it be used as fuel for a reality that was already beginning to fray. Some did it bravely. Some did it reluctantly. Some had no real understanding of what they were being drawn into. The kiln at the center of the world does not record such distinctions. It burns what it is given and waits for more. Yet even here, in the face of a system that has consumed gods, giants, and nameless unkindled, there is an element of choice. It might be small, it might be only a handful of steps, one hand extended toward a flame or held back. It might be the decision of a prince to refuse an expectation, of a legion to fight a corruption even when it breaks them, of a giant to entrust his own defeat to a friend, of a devourer to abandon the shrine and chase a private vision, of a little lord to remain seated when all others leave. In these small decisions, the pattern of ages acquires texture. For those who listen to these tales in quiet hours, the effect is often sleep rather than action. Yet even in rest, something settles. The age of fire becomes more than a backdrop. The Lords of Cinder become more than bosses in a distant game. They are figures in a long ritual, each bearing their own weight, each cast in light and shadow. The first flame remains what it always was, a source of disparity, a fire that divides and defines. The dark remains what it always was, a quiet fullness waiting at the edges of light. Between them walks humanity, hollowed and stubborn, carrying fragments of both. What comes after the last linking is not written here. The story pauses at the moment when ash drifts in the air around the kiln and the decision has just been made, or is about to be made, or will never be made the same way twice. Somewhere a bonfire crackles in a ruined shrine. Somewhere else a firekeeper closes her eyes as she cradles a fading light. In another possibility, a human ruler sits on a new kind of throne with dark sigils burning beneath the skin of their chest. The threads of fate have been woven into many loops around the same small fire. They may tighten, they may loosen. The only certainty is that disparity, once born, will continue to seek expression, and that someone somewhere will stand before it once more. Beneath all these choices, beneath even the kiln and its drifting ash, lies a figure whose presence is more felt than seen. Before there were kingdoms, before Gwyn raised Anor Londo into the sunlight, the furtive pygmy stood at the edge of the first flame and claimed a soul unlike the others. Where Gwyn's lord soul blazed, where Nito's soul gathered every ending and the witch's soul burned with creation, the dark soul seemed smaller, quieter, more suited to being divided. The pygmy did not raise banners. It did not found a city in its own name. It turned instead toward the shadows and began to share what it had found. The dark soul fractured. Each shard was small enough to fit inside a single frail being. Those beings walking on uncertain feet under a young sky became the first humans. In each chest, a fragment of the dark settled like a coal that had never yet been lit. The word humanity came later, but the substance it describes was already there. Humanity is not simply the condition of being human. In this world, it is a tangible thing, a concentrated piece of the dark soul that can be gathered, lost, found, and traded. It gives warmth to those who carry it. It can deform those who clutch it too tightly. The pygmy's restraint defined this hidden origin. With a soul that rivaled the gods in potential, the pygmy did not march against dragons or carve its name into the sky. It chose instead to disappear into its own gift, dissolving into a multitude. This meant that no single human could rival a lord alone. It also meant that the dark would outlast any one bearer. When Gwyn linked the fire, he burned a single massive soul. When humans died, their scattered humanity drifted into new forms, seeped into earth and fire, and whispered out of hollow throats. In the long ages that followed, this shared origin was forgotten by almost everyone. Gods told stories that began and ended with their own victories. Human kingdoms traced their lineages back to heroic founders, not to a quiet figure at the edge of a fire, yet the dark soul remembered itself in a different way. It remembered by gathering, wherever people clustered in great numbers, wherever desires and fears grew tangled, the dark thickened. Sometimes it congealed around a single individual, turning them into a seed of the abyss. Sometimes it seeped into the ground and changed the land itself. The abyss is one of the most difficult things to define in this setting. It is not simply emptiness or a hole in the world. It is the dark when it swells without guidance, when humanity multiplies without balance, when all the small, quiet fragments that were meant to be shared and lived through begin to collapse back into one another in panic. In places like Ulasil, where ancient sorcery meddled blindly with the remnants of Manus, the primeval man, the dark rose up as pain and fury made solid. In New Londo, where humans bargained with ghosts and power, the dark gathered beneath the city until it needed to be drowned to prevent it from consuming everything. In these outbreaks, the legacy of the pygmy shows its double edge. The gift of humanity allowed people to rise beyond simple servitude to gods. It also gave them the capacity to generate a threat that even dragons had never posed. The Lords of Cinder, stepping into the fire again and again, were not only preserving their own age, they were also trying to cap a pressure vessel built of forgotten human origin. Each linking pushed back both the quiet dark that might have become an age of man, and the swollen dark that manifested as abyss. Some knights and covenants devoted themselves to addressing this problem directly. Long before the Abyss Watchers shared blood, a single knight named Artorius walked into the dark with only his wolf and his courage. He failed, but his failure was not complete. He broke under the weight of the abyss, yet in doing so he shielded others and showed that the dark could be met not only with hatred, but with a grim form of compassion. His story passed into myth, and from that myth the Watchers drew their name and aim. They did not know the pygmy's face. They sought only to keep the swelling dark from spilling into the lands where humans lived. The fire's keepers in these stories are not only warriors and kings, they are also those who tend small flames in quiet places. Firekeepers sit beside bonfires and offer their own souls as anchors. To kindle a bonfire with their help is to ask them to share part of themselves with a place, making it easier for the curse to return. Their eyes, when unbound, can see the flow of souls and the faint roots that fate prefers. They speak softly as if afraid to disturb something fragile. Their restraint is both physical and spiritual. They remain where they are placed. They do not seek to rule. They can only offer guidance, a hand extended toward one fire or another. Bonfires themselves are more than piles of bones and glowing coals. They are points where the first flame's power touches the world like roots. The coiled swords that rise from them are not simple weapons. They are icons driven into the fabric of reality, marking places where the dead can cling. When an undead dies and returns to a bonfire, they are following that hidden structure. Some fragment of their being is drawn along a thread of fire back to where their soul last settled. Each return wears them down, but it also proves that something remains, something that even repeated death cannot shake loose. Over many cycles, this pattern teaches a lesson that few can articulate but many feel. Death is real but not final. Memory is fragile but not entirely lost. The world ends in small ways every day, in crumbled walls, in forgotten names, in roads swallowed by swamp. Yet the fundamental forces do not vanish. The first flame fades and flares, the dark ebbs and flows, humanity is lost and regained. The Lords of Cinder burn and return as echoes. Firekeepers die and are replaced by others who take up the same task, repeating the same words beside new ashes. The kingdoms that rise between linkings leave their own marks on this cycle. In Drangleic, ruled by Vendrick, a human king tried to build a realm without directly embracing the doctrine of linking, seeking power from giants and ancient dragons instead. In other lands, ambitious sorcerers and monarchs attempted to harness the dark for their own ends, building cults and cities atop fault lines they did not recognize. Each of these experiments ended in ruination, yet each also added to the ledger of possibilities. The cycle of fire and dark is simple, but the ways in which people live beneath it are complex, layered, and often contradictory. The Sable Church of Lundor, arising late in these histories, embodies one of the most radical responses to the eternal pattern. Its leaders, the so-called Pilgrims of Dark, look at the record of linkings and see not noble sacrifices but a trap. To them, Gwyn's first decision to link the fire was a mistake that should never have been repeated. They revere the idea of an age of dark, not as horror but as fulfillment. In their teachings, humans are not accidents of the flame. They are rightful heirs to the world, and the dark soul within them is not a threat to be contained but a birthright to be claimed. To prepare for this envisioned age, Lundor cultivates hollows. Instead of treating hollowing as a shameful decline, they gather those who have lost their shape and give them meaning in the collective. They mark chosen ones with dark sigils that bind their fates together. They whisper legends not of shining knights, but of pygmy lords, the small, quiet figures from whom humanity descends. Their restraint is selective. They do not rush openly against the shrines of the fire. They work in shadows, training a few to walk the path toward the kiln with a different purpose in mind. When an unkindled meets their agents, a new possibility enters the story. The choice is no longer only whether to feed the flame or let it fade. The unkindled may also choose to usurp it, to take into themselves both the first flame and the dark that has long surrounded it, becoming Lord of Hollows. In this outcome, the fire does not sit apart, demanding periodic sacrifices. It burns within a human ruler who has accepted the dark fully. The age that follows such an act is hard to imagine. The game does not show it unfolding. It leaves only hints and titles. Yet the existence of this path alone changes how all previous linkings are remembered. Looking back across the long span from the age of ancients to this moment of multiplied endings and branching paths, the role of the Lords of Cinder becomes easier to understand and more difficult to judge. They are not simply villains who cling to power, nor purely heroes who selflessly sacrifice for others. Each lord is a person or collective who made a decision under pressure within the beliefs and fears of their time and lived or died with its consequences. Gwyn believed that without his light, the world would fall into a chaos he could not accept. Nito withdrew into death and let others decide how his power should be used. The Witch of Izalith tried to replace what was fading and birthed new terrors. The Abyss Watchers tried to contain a darkness that arose from the very soul humans had been given. Yorm linked the fire to save his city from another flame, only to see it burned anyway. Aldrich devoured until even gods became food, his dream turning into a nightmare for everyone but himself. Lothric refused to follow the path carved for him, at the cost of the kingdom that had built his fate. Ludleth stepped forward when no one else did, and then sat, burnt and small, so that others would have a place to return to. In all these stories, there are quiet, unnamed figures as well. The knights who followed Artorias into the abyss and never returned. The wardens of New Lundo who agreed to flood their own city to halt the spread of the dark. The common undead who died in ditches and cellars, never reaching a kiln, never hearing their own names carved into thrones. Their lives weigh on the same scales as those of the lords. Their suffering fills the spaces between great events. Their persistence, hollow and stubborn, is the reason the cycle continues at all. If one listens closely, the world itself seems to speak in triads. Flame, dark, and the beings who walk between them. Sacrifice, failure, and renewal. Memory, forgetting, and the stories that try to bridge them. Each age arranges these elements in a different pattern, but they do not change in their essence. The Lords of Cinder are points where these patterns loop back on themselves. Each is a place where a soul that has grown heavy with experience is converted into fuel. At the edges of these tales, the physical world bears the marks of what has happened. In the land of Lothric, distant peaks lean toward the base of the castle, dragged inward as if the place where the flame still flickers is drawing everything toward it. Ancient fortresses sit atop newer towns. Lost kingdoms stand at strange angles beside recent churches. Time, pulled by the gravity of the fire, frays and overlaps. For those living through this, the effect is disorienting. They may see a tower from a forgotten era beside a house built only a few years ago. They may walk from a forest into a city whose stones remember another land's name. This collapsing of eras is the structural sign that the cycle is nearing some kind of limit. When the distinction between one age and the next becomes unstable, When ruins no longer sink but rise alongside the present, it becomes harder to speak of continuation as if it were simple. The Lords of Cinder are no longer neatly separated in time. Their legacies overlap, each casting a shadow over the others. Yorm's despair, Aldrich's hunger, the Watcher's madness, Lothric's refusal and Ludleth's burnt patience all coexist now in the same strained moment. In this sense, the Ashen One's journey through Lothric is not just a series of trials set by designers. It is a passage through a layered archive of sacrifices and mistakes. Each boss fight, each ruined stronghold, each bonfire is a page in a book that has been copied over too many times. The ink of old stories bleeds through the parchment of the new. To move through it is to be written into it, to have ash and ember cling to one's own name until it too can no longer be cleanly separated from the rest. At the end, in whatever ending one chooses to hold as most true, there is a moment of quiet. The last blow has been struck, the last prayer spoken, the last ember either flares or is covered. In that quiet, the elements that have defined this myth settle into a new arrangement. There is always some light, even in an age of dark, even if it is only the glow of humanity and a few survivors. There is always some shadow, even in an age of fire, even if it is only the doubt in a prince's mind. There is always someone who stands at the edge of these forces and must decide how to move. The sleep-friendly quality of these tales lies not in their violence, but in their repetition. Fire fades, fire is linked, dark rises, dark is pushed back. People forget, people remember. The names change, the faces beneath helms change. The hands that hold talismans and swords change. The pattern, with small variations, remains. To lie listening to these stories is to drift on that pattern, to feel the way disparity, once introduced, can never be removed, only rearranged. Somewhere in a place that might be a shrine or might be only a memory of one, a small bonfire burns. Its light does not reach far. It warms the stones immediately around it and paints a few steps in soft orange. A firekeeper sits near it, hands folded, listening. She hears footsteps in the dark, sometimes approaching, sometimes fading. She has heard many such steps. Each carries its own weight, its own mix of fear and determination. Each belongs to someone who has come seeking an answer that the flame cannot fully give. Beyond that circle of light, the land stretches away in broken silhouettes. Arch trees from the oldest age, crumbling walls from intermediate ages, twisted towers from the most recent. Above them all, a sky that may be bright, may be dim, may be turning slowly toward either dawn or dusk. It is in this landscape that the Lords of Cinder are remembered, not as distant deities, but as former travelers who walked their own versions of this path, and then chose to step into the fire or step away. There is no single final word spoken over them, no inscription that captures every aspect of what they did. There is only the soft naming of their titles, the retelling of their stories, the acknowledgement that without them the time of fire would have ended long ago, and that because of them it has stretched perhaps further than it should. The age that follows will judge them differently. Some will be praised as guardians, some will be condemned as jailers, some will be forgotten. The ash does not care. It settles over all things equally, cloaking sharp edges, softening outlines, making it easier at last to sleep.